Today we are here to talk about justice, but this talk is going to be a bit different from many of the conversations we hear about justice, especially justice in the workplace. For example, I am not here to sell you what basically amounts to slogans that sound moral and motivating, yet lack real substance, rational foundation, or clear, actionable direction. Everything that I'm going to tell you today is something that has scientific support, that uplifts and benefits everyone, and are things that you can do right now without demanding system change from anybody else. And this is coming from somebody with a history of social and political activism. So where do we begin when it comes to justice? Well, there is a concept called distributive justice, and distributive justice is incredibly important to build into our organizations. Distributive justice involves the perceptions of the fairness of reward and resource distributions. It is positively correlated with a lot of important workplace attitudes and behaviors. So for example, it is positively correlated with how much people trust your organization, with how committed they are to your organization, how satisfied they are with their job in general and with outcomes in particular, and how much they engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, which are basically altruistic or courteous behaviors that go above and beyond the scope of your job duties. So if somebody brings a birthday cake to work for you and it's your birthday, there's nothing in their official job duties that says you must bring a birthday cake or you're going to get fired. But it is a nice thing to do. It makes the workplace feel more warm and welcoming. Similarly, when somebody decides to take on your shift because you have an emergency, there's nothing in their contract saying they have to do that, but it is a nice thing to do. All of these things are positively correlated with distributive justice. Distributive justice is also correlated with fewer negative reactions like disengagement and quitting. Now, all of these things make distributive justice undoubtedly important, but before we talk about how to build distributive justice into your organizations, we have to talk about what I call the equity elephant in the room. So as the introduction mentioned, I am a member of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and I am a DEI researcher. Well, it turns out, based on my research, a lot of organizations have been doing equity wrong, because true equity theory is a bit different from what many people talk about it. So true equity theory involves inputs and outcomes, what we put into the job and what we get as a reward for that. So inputs are everything from our efforts, our skills and experience we bring to the table, the number of hours worked, anything we put into the job. Outcomes are what we get out of it, like rewards. Not just the typical rewards that we think of, like money and benefits, but also status, responsibilities, opportunities for advancement, things like that. Equity theory says that we need to focus on the inputs, the fair inputs and the outcomes, and that we tend to compare each other based on the inputs that we put in, the outcomes we get, and the inputs that other people put in and the outcomes they get. I want to be clear here, nowhere in that definition does it explicitly mention certain criteria like race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, or gender identity. Okay, now that's important because as a DEI researcher, I see a lot of organizations encouraging, if not outright forcing, outcomes based on certain identity characteristics. And this is a problem, firstly, because people are not blind. They can tell when they are being advantaged or discriminated against. In order to fix this, we need to go back to what Martin Luther King Jr. famously said. We need to judge each other by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, for example. And in this case, when it comes to building distributive justice in the workplace, this means judging people and rewarding people based on the proven content of their character, the proven knowledge, skills, and abilities they bring to the table, and the proven inputs that they put into the job, and rewarding them accordingly. That is true distributive justice and true equity. So how do we do this in the workplace? Well, one of the best places to start is to be clear about the core knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that bear directly on the job position we're looking at and the organization. This is going to be different for every organization. An organization that is a nonprofit might put more emphasis on grants and grant proposals to raise money than a regular corporation. So it depends on the job, but you need to be clear on what these things are so that you know what inputs to reward and which ones to reward more than others. But it's not just enough to know what you want to reward and what is important to your organization. You also need to have specific ways to measure these things, to reliably and accurately measure them. Otherwise, you don't know if you're any closer to your goal. Next, we need to, once we have the core knowledge, skills, and abilities and a way to accurately measure them, we need to make sure these measurements are based on behaviorally observable actions, not intentions. Now that's important because we are defined by our actions. I like to say that nobody's tombstone has ever been engraved with what they intended to do with their life. Nobody has ever had their epitaph read, intended to be a loving father and a husband, but was actually belligerent, abusive, and neglectful. So we're going to say he was a loving and supportive father and husband. Actions are the metric here, behaviorally observable actions. Finally, we need to make sure that nobody is being arbitrarily rewarded or punished more or less than anybody else for the same kinds of behaviors. So if we would not tolerate a man making explicit sexual remarks about a woman in the workplace, we should not tolerate a woman making sexual remarks about a man. And if you're going to send one of them to sexual harassment training for violating that, you need to send the other one too. Now, these seem pretty simple, and yet I can tell you as an IO psychologist, frequently people violate these principles. So the first steps to distributive justice: be clear on what knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics you want to reward, have accurate and reliable ways to measure these, and consistently check to make sure that these are being enforced reasonably, not arbitrarily. However, as good as distributive justice is, it has nothing on my favorite kind of justice, procedural justice. Like distributive justice, procedural justice is positively correlated with a lot of important workplace attitudes and behaviors, like organizational commitment, like trust, organizational citizenship behaviors, job satisfaction, outcome satisfaction, so on and so forth. And like distributive justice, it is also correlated with fewer negative reactions like disengagement and quitting. However, procedural justice has a couple of distinct advantages. It is more strongly correlated with almost every single one of those variables that distributive justice is. So all the things that distributive justice positively predicts, like trust, procedural justice has a stronger correlation. Why does that matter? Because procedural justice concerns the perceptions of fairness of the way that outcomes are determined. So you can think of it like distributive justice is the relationship between inputs and outcomes. Procedural justice is the rules we use to determine why those inputs and outcomes are linked. Procedural justice is also correlated with another variable that distributive justice is not. This is performance. This means that people tend to perform better at work, along with all these other important variables, when they perceive that reward and resource allocation has been determined fairly, even if it doesn't personally benefit them. I want to be clear on that last point, even if it doesn't personally benefit them. Why that matters is because earlier I said that we should, in general, reward people equal rewards for equal work, equal punishments for equal transgressions, and in general that is true. However, it can be deceptively simple. It can actually be really difficult to flesh out. So for example, let's say another person and I were working at the same company, but this other person brings more job relevant experience into it. So same company, same department, same job title, same work, but they have more job relevant experience. Should we be rewarded exactly the same? On paper, it looks like, if they're rewarded differently, it looks like this is unfair, it's unjust. And yet, theoretically anyways, that experience has made them more capable at performing the job than I am. And they might have access to more opportunities or responsibilities, perhaps being a project lead or something like that. What if this other person in this example has been with the company longer than I have? Everything else is equal. So same company, same department, same job title. This is especially common in certain roles like teaching. But they have more tenure in the organization. Should we be rewarded exactly the same? I bring up teachers because this is one of the main complaints I hear from my teacher friends, especially the older people, family, friends, and whatnot. To give you an example, one teacher I know, she's been a teacher for 30 years, And in that time frame, her salary is only increased like $5,000 or so. She's now making $65,000. New people who've just come into teaching, 0 years of actual experience, are making $65,000. So they're making exactly what she's making, but they don't have any of that experience and any of that long-term loyalty to the company. And this leads people to, of course, ask, well, what the hell is the point in me sticking around here if I'm not going to be rewarded for it? So, again, I don't think in those instances that it is unfair to say one person, despite everything on paper being equal, should be rewarded the same. What if this other person has proven they are more skilled at the job? So everything else is the same, but they have proven they can do the exact same tasks with less supervision, less mistakes, and they can do them faster and more effectively. Should we be rewarded exactly the same? This is important because, again, on paper, a lot of the conversations I hear about justice in the workplace, they take one or two variables and they hyper-focus on those at the exclusion of all others. But procedural justice shows us that people are fine, even happy, with so-called unequal outcomes if they know the procedures to determine those outcomes have been done in a fair, impartial way. And this is why even more than distributive justice, we need to have procedural justice. So how do we build procedural justice into the workplace? Now, if I were to cover every aspect of an organization, we would be here for weeks. So instead, I'm going to focus on my specialty and the one that is most susceptible to discrimination and bias, the hiring process. How do we create procedural justice in the hiring process? The first step is to do a job analysis. A job analysis means looking at a wide variety of people who have held a job before and honing in on those key knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, KSAOs, to see what defines people in these roles, what leads to success. This is much better than trying to to imagine what somebody might look like who has this job, because we're all human. We're all fallible creatures. We all, unfortunately, this is actually a big one, it can't be understated, we all are influenced by Hollywood, okay? A lot of the experience we get when we think about other jobs don't come from direct experience, it comes from what we see in Hollywood. Like, how many of us, or how many people I should say, really know what a cop's job looks like day in and day out? Or a firefighter, or a nurse, or an accountant. Most of us only get a glimpse of those things from Hollywood, which, as we all know, is super reliable. So we need to do the job analysis so we don't bring those fallible assumptions into the workplace and end up hiring people based on a load of crap. Or so we don't end up projecting our own possible biases based on certain identity characteristics. It's also better than trying to use somebody who's held a similar position before as a template for this new position, because we could bring in irrelevant job identity characteristics. So, to give you an uncontroversial example here, when I think of a CEO, I usually think of somebody who's gregarious, somebody who's extroverted, but there are plenty of introverted CEOs out there. When I think of an accountant, I usually think of somebody who's kind of shy, demure, introverted. But what does that have to do with actual accounting ability? In the case of the CEO, again, there are plenty of people who are not gregarious, who are not seeking to be in the limelight all the time, you know? So we want to make sure that we're really honing in on the knowledge, skills, and abilities that bear directly on the success of that organization, not stereotypes or assumptions. And that's the importance of a job analysis. The other thing we can do is to create structured interview questions, to use structured interviews rather than unstructured interviews. A structured interview means you ask everybody the same questions in the exact same way and you do not deviate. Why is that important? Because if I ask you 10 questions, and I ask you 10 questions, and then I ask her 11 questions, now she's got an extra shot to score on something that nobody else had an opportunity to do. And that's not fair. For all we know, if I had asked y'all the 11th question, y'all would have knocked it out of the park. Y'all might even scored higher than she did, but I didn't give you that opportunity. So now we're not comparing apples to apples. We have to compare people across equal criteria so that the only difference is in their knowledge, skills, abilities, and experiences they bring to the table. Finally, this is where it gets a little bit more technical, we need to create behaviorally anchored interview scales for those open-ended structured interview questions. This basically means you have a rubric for grading people's responses. Okay, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best, but all of these are anchored in behaviors. So if you say to somebody, tell me about a time that you demonstrated leadership ability in a stressful situation, and they say something like, well, you know, when the heat is on, something snaps, man, and I take charge, right? That doesn't mean anything. What does that mean in terms of a behavior? What does it look like to take charge? But if they say, yeah, one time I was working at a restaurant, I was a host and a server, let's say, and we were towards the end of the night, everybody was exhausted, we were understaffed, and then suddenly we got flooded with customers, and everybody was freaking out. So I took charge by doing, for example, every time somebody came in the door, I said, hey, we're a little understaffed right now, wait times will be longer than usual, but if that's okay, we would love to have you. And I told all my coworkers to say the exact same thing so that the customers could make an informed decision, their expectations would be tempered realistically, and then we sat them down and I told my coworkers to seat them in relatively the same area so people who are already exhausted are not rushing all over the restaurant and exhausting themselves further. And then if people really got antsy, I told everybody, just give them like free chips and guac or something like that. That shows through behaviors what taking charge of a situation looks like, demonstrating leadership abilities. But simply saying, I take charge of a situation, that doesn't mean anything. So you've got to have behaviorally anchored interview scales to measure the responses to open-ended structural questions based on a job analysis. Distributive justice, procedural justice, very important. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk about informational justice. Informational justice means giving people clear and thorough explanations for how and why these procedures are determined the way they're determined. This matters because you could have the most fair system in the world, but if people don't believe you, if they think the system is rigged or it's unfair, they're still going to act out. They're still going to look for other jobs. So you've got to tell them why these systems work the way they do. And often this means taking a good hard look at your systems. Because sometimes when you ask people in an organization, why do we do things this way? They'll say, I don't know, but my boss probably knows. And you go to their boss and you say, why do you do things this way? And they go, I don't know, my boss probably knows. You go up and up and up, and then they go, well, we do this way because we always do things this way. Which is not an explanation that anybody wants to hear when they're trying to chart their career path. So, how do we build informational justice into the workplace? Well, there's the obvious of giving clear and thorough explanations, but I want to go a little bit farther than that. I think we should use video games as a template. Now, I'm looking around, I know not everybody has played video games here, but to put it simply, video game players never have to wonder how close they are to leveling up. They never have to wonder what they need to do to unlock a new piece of armor or weapon or access to a mission zone. They never have to wonder. How many times have we wondered in our careers, is this the right time to ask for a promotion? When would be the right time? How many of us have had to ask, where exactly am I in my career progression? How do I know what I have to do to get to the next level? We should take a lesson from video games and design our organizations with such clarity in the processes that people never have to wonder what they need to do to get a promotion or a raise. So for example, if you're leading an accounting organization, you could say, in order to be eligible for a senior accountant role, you have to have at least 8 years of full-time accounting experience in this role or another role, and or be able to demonstrate this, that, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. And here is what we accept as reasonable proof of those knowledge, skills, and abilities. The reason I use that second part is because all too often organizations will use years of experience as the primary proof of mastery. And the problem is, I think we've all met people who have been in a position for a long time, but to put it bluntly, they suck at their job. So, why don't we use tests that measure somebody's competence? So if during those 8 years, they've really been building their skills and knowledge, let them show that on the tests. But then if you got somebody who says, you know, I'm really ambitious, I want to go for that senior accounting role in 4 years. Let me do whatever I need to take whatever certifications I need to take so that I am prepared for that. Let those people prove their worth as well. We need to be clear and thorough about our explanations and procedures and design them so that people can aim at a goal and then use their own free will and strategies to get there. Justice in the workplace is a hugely popular topic, and we don't have time to get into all of the ways that we can build it in the workplace. But distributive justice, procedural justice, and informational justice are a great start. Too often when I hear people talk about justice in the workplace, they give illegal or unethical advice, vague recommendations, or things that are simply not supported by thorough scientific analysis. But fortunately for us, justice in a very real way is a science. We know what it is, we know what works, and we know how to do it. By using the science of justice to include distributive justice, procedural justice, and informational justice in the workplace, we can build a more just workplace for everyone, and by extension, a more just world. Thank you.